for the Portuguese to secure their trading posts, they had to build a fort because they knew that sooner or later other European nations will be coming with their sailing ships to also participate in that trade, and they knew more than likely they would like to conquer, the Portuguese and claim that whole territory for themselves. So they had to think ahead of time. They sent the man Don Diego de Zambuja to, lead the mission to build a fort or a castle. Every fort has a battlement, and every battlement is equipped with cannons. And in this case, the cannons were pointed to the sea, where the suspected European competition will be coming from, right? So Don Diego de Zambuja arrived with 9 caravelas, 2 ships containing building materials. They also had some 600 soldiers and some priests with them because of the faith of the Portuguese during that time, right? So when they arrived, there was a boy who sailed with them, a young man maybe, and this young man was going to later be known as the most famous explorer of all time. Loved by some, hated by many, but it still doesn't take away from his fame and his exploits. This young man's name was Christopher Columbus, the Italian explorer. So if you're ever asked, did Christopher Columbus ever visit the Gold Coast? The answer is yes, right? So that is history for you. And I'm sure he took a lot of notes and learned from the Portuguese relationship with the Gold Coast, and maybe he overcorrected some of them. That is history. We have that as history. Let's move on. Don Diego de Zambuja meets with the chief Caramansa in the Portuguese record, but there's no fancy name like Caramansa. His name was Kwamina Ansa. Kwamina Ansa was the chief of Edna. So Don Diego de Zambuja sought to gain permission to acquire a piece of land to build his forts, but Kwamina Ansa suspected, that they had an axe to grind. A pulga atrás da orelha. It felt like there was a flea behind the ears of the chief, because it looked like the Portuguese wanted now to settle and create or build such a building. Means that they really have interest to stay, and they suspected it. But the Portuguese, led by Don Diego de Zambuja, used threats to strong arm the chief and his people to give them permission. So they finally got the permission they were seeking after, and they picked a place where they were going to build this fort. But to pick that favorable position, defensive position, right, they needed to destroy some buildings that belonged to the villagers, and also they had to quarry a rock, to offer building materials to build the fort. Just so you know, they also traveled with 100 builders or craftsmen, meaning masons and carpenters, right? But before they will destroy the buildings that belonged to the locals and quarry the rock was actually believed by the people of Edna to be inhabited by the spirit of the god of the river Benya. The river Benya. The people of Edna were animists, and they believed that certain rocks or mountains and trees or rivers had spirits in them. So they believed that this rock was sacred, and the Portuguese, in order to quarry that rock and destroy those buildings, they decided to compensate the people of Edna. And the man João Bernal was given this gift to give to the locals, their noblemen, as compensation. But for some reason he delayed in transferring this compensation to the people. He only did so after the quarrying and the demolition of the villagers' buildings and the construction had begun. So it was too late. This led to the people being angry and attacking some of the Portuguese and killed some of them. But they didn't kill Christopher Columbus. Anyway, so it's just a joke. So the Portuguese also got angry about the situation, but both parties met and an understanding was made, and compensation was also made, and the construction continued. But that didn't stop the antagonization between the two parties. They still fought. The Portuguese also had to retaliate by burning some of the buildings belonging to the locals. It's like, rubbing salt on injury, but that's what happened. So despite the opposition by the locals, the Portuguese were still able to finish the first story of the fort in 20 days. I told you these Portuguese were very smart. So they brought with them building materials, prefabricated building materials from all the way from Portugal to the Gold Coast. So it was more like an assembly work than building everything from scratch. I told you, you can't afford to be broke and stupid at the same time. Kudos to the Portuguese for this feat. Now, later on, the whole building, including the chapel, was completed, and they did it sooner than expected. Just so you know, every fort or castle had a chapel in them because of the faith of the Portuguese. They were Catholics, so that is what happened. The Elmina Castle is the first of its kind to be built in sub-Saharan Africa, and it remains to this day. Later on, way later on, the Elmina Castle was used to store or keep slaves to be transported later on to the Americas. But that wasn't the main purpose for which they built it. The time they built it, slave trade was not a thing yet, right? So the Portuguese dominated the whole region of the Gold Coast from Axim in the west all the way to the region around Denu in the east. And they enjoyed profitable gold trade and ivory trade and pepper trade. They later on built two forts, Fort Santo Antonio de Axim in Axim, and Fort Shama in Cape Coast. And they later on bought the Christiansborg Castle in Osu from Denmark, Norway. During that time, Denmark and Norway sailed together, to offer a more competitive advantage. So they sailed with one name, Denmark, Norway. The town Elmina declared itself an independent state with its own governor, and the people of Elmina enjoyed protection from the Portuguese. This is the Frank Shitter Show. I'm going to put Shitter on something. I'm going to take a little break. Catch me. We're going to be talking in the next half about the psychology of the Portuguese and how things went after the building of the Elmina Castle. Did other Europeans come sailing like they suspected? What happened? We'll learn about it in the next bit. Frank Shitter Show.